You know, if you grew up in the 70s, there was one name that was absolutely everywhere: O'Neal. Ryan O'Neal was the golden boy of the silver screen, the ultimate heartthrob. But then, in 1973, this tiny 10-year-old girl with a bowl cut and a serious gaze stepped into the frame and, quite frankly, stole the heart of the entire nation. I'm talking, of course, about Tatum O'Neal. Watching her in Paper Moon even today, you can't help but be mesmerized. She wasn't just cute, she was a powerhouse. When she stood on that stage at the Academy Awards, holding an Oscar that looked way too big for her small hands, she became the youngest winner in history. We all watched that moment on our TV sets and thought we were witnessing the start of a legendary American dream. But as the old saying goes, all that glitters is not gold. While the cameras were flashing, the reality behind those Hollywood gates was far from a fairy tale. Behind the scenes, that little girl was navigating a world of broken promises and a father who struggled to share the spotlight. How did the world's most famous child star end up a cautionary tale? Why did the very industry that crowned her queen leave her to fight her darkest battles alone? Tonight, I want to take a look back at the life of Tatum O'Neal. It's a story about fame, a complicated family legacy, and the high price of a childhood lost to the bright lights. Grab a coffee, settle in, and let's talk about what really happened to Hollywood's golden child.
When we look back at Hollywood in the 70s, we usually picture a flawless, sun-drenched California dream. It was an era of massive ambitions and even bigger egos. At the center of that golden whirlwind stood Ryan O'Neal. Back then, he wasn't just an actor, he was the gold standard of success. After Love Story, the world was at his feet. But there was one thing the public missed behind those dazzling magazine cover smiles. Ryan was a man who couldn't handle losing, not even to his own children. Little Tatum was born into an environment where camera time was worth more than a quiet family dinner. Her mother, Joanna Moore, was a stunning and talented actress, but she was fighting her own private wars with prescription drug addiction, which eventually drove a wedge between her and her daughter. Imagine a child's world where mom is constantly lost in a haze of her own struggles, and dad is an untouchable god who only drops by between film shoots and never-ending parties. From her earliest years, Tatum learned that love wasn't unconditional. It was something you had to earn. She saw how her father came alive when the lenses were focused on him, and she likely realized subconsciously, if you want dad to notice you, you have to be in the spotlight too. The O'Neal house was never the cozy family nest we like to imagine. It was a crossroads, a revolving door for celebrities, producers, and the hangers-on of the era. Tatum grew up surrounded by adults who acted like children, and she had to grow up fast just to survive. She saw things no child her age should see: parties that bled into the morning, the eccentric habits of the guests, and the ease with which everyone around her checked out of reality using various mood enhancers. But most of all, she felt a sharp, ringing emptiness. Ryan O'Neal was a complicated father. He was a mix of incredible charisma and a hair-trigger temper. He demanded perfection from Tatum, yet he was subconsciously competing with her. For him, life was a grand stage, and he always had to be the lead. Little Tatum quickly learned to read her father's moods by the slightest twitch of an eyebrow. She became hyper-observant, almost hypersensitive to the emotions of those around her, a trait that would later make her a brilliant actress, but in her childhood, it was simply a survival mechanism. She wasn't playing with dolls, she was learning to navigate adults who didn't even know what they wanted. When the project Paper Moon appeared on the horizon, it looked like the perfect opportunity. For Ryan, it was a chance to cement his A-list status. For Tatum, it was a chance to finally spend time with her father, to be his partner, his equal. She believed that if they worked together, the chasm between them in real life would finally close. She had no way of knowing that this film, while bringing her world-class acclaim, would forever alter the trajectory of her life.
It would turn her from a child into a commodity, a marketing tool, a little woman whose right to a normal, unscripted childhood had been stolen. The whole world was getting ready to applaud, but no one bothered to ask if a 10-year-old girl was ready for her private life to become public property. When director Peter Bogdanovich decided to adapt the novel Addie Pray, he was looking for a spark, something that would make audiences believe in the story of two grifters navigating the dusty backroads of Depression-era America. Then he found them, a real-life father and daughter. The idea seemed brilliant, leveraging their natural bond, their physical resemblance, and that unexplainable chemistry that only exists between kin. But no one, not even Bogdanovich, could have predicted that this 10-year-old girl with a pixie cut and a gaze far too serious for her age would literally steal the movie. Working on Paper Moon was Tatum's first true collision with the professional world, and she met the challenge with staggering grace. While her father, Ryan, leaned on his experience and his status as a Hollywood A-lister, Tatum simply lived within the frame. Her character, Addie Pray, was a mirror of Tatum herself, a child forced to grow up overnight to survive a harsh world. Something extraordinary happened on that set. This little girl wasn't just memorizing lines, she was dictating the rhythm of the scenes. She handled long pages of dialogue like a pro, puffed on herbal cigarettes as if she'd been doing it for a lifetime, and delivered performances that left the crew breathless. Watching from the sidelines, Ryan O'Neal began to feel the shift. He had arrived on set as the king, but he increasingly realized he was becoming the backdrop for his daughter's talent. It was a dangerous dynamic. To this day, Hollywood legends circulate about how tense things were behind the scenes. Ryan, a man gifted to the spotlight, felt his young daughter outclassing him at every turn. Instead of offering fatherly support, he often reacted with coldness and irritation. Meanwhile, Tatum, still just a little girl desperate for her father's approval, pushed herself to 200%. She thought that if she played the part even better, if she became the ultimate actress, her father would finally look at her with pride instead of envy. When the film hit theaters in 1973, it was a bombshell. Audiences loved the duo, but critics were unanimous. Look at the girl. Tatum became a national sensation. Then came that night in April 1974, the Academy Awards. Picture the scene, the glamour of old Hollywood, the biggest names in cinema history packed into one room, and little Tatum in a custom-tailored tuxedo, sporting a look that was years ahead of its time. When the envelope was opened and her name was called, the room exploded. She walked onto that stage, small, fragile, yet incredibly poised, and became the youngest Oscar winner in history. In that moment, the world was at her feet. People wept, newspapers prepped headlines about the new queen of Hollywood, and producers were already lining up with million-dollar checks. It was the summit, the absolute peak that adult actors spend lifetimes chasing. But behind the blinding glare of the spotlights, a shadow was falling. In the middle of that cheering crowd sat her father, and his heart was not filled with pure joy. That Oscar wasn't just a trophy, it became an invisible wall between them. For Tatum, the victory felt like the start of a new life, but she didn't yet realize that the gold statuette had just cost her any chance of simple human warmth at home. She had won the adoration of millions, but that same night, she began to lose the only person whose validation truly mattered.
This chapter is quite heavy, so I've focused on capturing that sense of lost innocence, using terms that resonate with the American experience of 70s celebrity culture, like Studio 54 and the gold mine metaphor. Chapter 3, The Golden Ticket to Nowhere. You know, life has a cruel way of turning a moment of triumph into your hardest trial. For Tatum, Oscar night should have been a fairy tale, but instead, it was the point of no return. Imagine being 10 years old. You've just received the highest honor in the world, but when you go home, there's no celebratory cake or warm hugs, only a bone-chilling silence. Ryan O'Neal couldn't forgive his daughter for achieving what he, despite all his fame, never could. That night, he didn't even give her a kiss. Later, he would bitterly claim that her win ruined their relationship. From his perspective, it was the truth.
But for Tatum, she had instantly transformed from a child into a blue-chip asset. Hollywood in the 70s was vibrant, but it was a shark tank. The moment you hold an Oscar, the adults stop seeing a person and start seeing a brand. Tatum became the it girl for every high-profile event, invited to places where a 10-year-old has absolutely no business being. She became a regular at the legendary Studio 54, the epicenter of every excess that era had to offer. Picture it. A little girl sitting at a table with Andy Warhol, rock stars, and supermodels, while questionable drinks flowed like water and the air was thick with the smoke of illicit substances. People treated her as a peer, like a grown woman trapped in a child's body. She was offered things kids her age hadn't even heard of. The saddest part of the story is that there wasn't a single adult nearby to take her by the hand and say, "You don't belong here, let's go home." Instead of protection, she was given total freedom, which at that age is more like a life sentence. Her father was too wrapped up in his own career and love life to care who she was hanging out with or what time she got back. Tatum became a fixture in a scene where moral boundaries were non-existent. She started experimenting with party favors, simply because it was the air she breathed. For her, it was a way to drown out the deafening emptiness and loneliness waiting for her at home. She felt that if she acted like an adult, she would finally be accepted and truly loved. Her post-Oscar career followed a bizarre path as well. Rather than carefully selecting roles to grow as an artist, she was often pushed into projects by producers or her father. Every move she made was tabloid fodder. If she looked sad, it was front-page news. If she wore a daring outfit, it was a scandal. She lived in a fishbowl, with millions of eyes tracking her every move. By 14, she felt like an industry veteran, world-weary and exhausted by the attention. It was then she started seeking refuge in relationships with much older men. She was looking for a father figure, the rock that Ryan never was. But Hollywood is the last place to find sincere devotion. Each new romance just left more scars on her heart and pushed her closer to the edge. She was still the golden girl on the outside, but inside, a rebellion was brewing against a system that used her talent and gave nothing back but camera flashes and the hollow pleasures that were slowly dragging her into an abyss.
By the early 80s, Tatum O'Neal was no longer the wide-eyed child we saw on the Oscar stage. At 20 years old, she felt like someone who had lived 3 lifetimes and walked away disappointed by every single one. She was desperate for an exit strategy, a way out of the relentless cycle of Hollywood parties and the toxic dynamic with her father. That's when fate introduced her to a man who seemed to be forged from the very same steel as she was, John McEnroe. He was the bad boy of world tennis, a genius with a racket and a hair-triggered temper that made umpires flinch and stadiums roar. Their meeting was like 2 storms colliding. To the American public, they were a match made in heaven, the youngest Oscar winner and the world's #1 seed. Paparazzi hounded them at every turn, but inside the relationship, Tatum felt something for the first time that she had always lacked, an illusion of safety. John was strong, headstrong, and most importantly, completely independent of Hollywood. She felt that by marrying him, she could finally slam the door on her past, leaving behind her father's coldness and the self-destructive habits that were already beginning to chip away at her health. She practically fled into the marriage, hoping the roles of wife and mother would be the life raft she so desperately needed. They tied the knot in 1986, and for a while, Tatum actually dropped off the industry's radar. She had 3 children, and in her own words, those were the only moments in her life when she felt truly normal and needed. She tried to play the part of the perfect homemaker, building the cozy domestic life she never had as a child. But unfortunately, old trauma doesn't vanish just because you change your last name. John McEnroe, for all his love, was an authoritarian and demanding man. His career required ironclad discipline, while Tatum still carried the fragility and instability that Hollywood had bred into her. Slowly, the domestic ideal began to fracture.
Tatum realized she had simply traded one cage for another. If her father had controlled her life before, her husband did now. She found herself living in the shadow of a legendary athlete, and her own identity began to fade once again. During this time, the shadows of her past, the escapes she had turned to as a teenager, started creeping back. The loneliness of a massive house and her inner demons proved stronger than her desire to be just a mother. The arguments grew louder, and by the early 90s, the union that seemed so rock solid finally buckled. The divorce was messy, loud, and devastating, but the ultimate blow for Tatum was losing custody of her children. The court, citing her instability and the substances she was increasingly turning to for comfort, ruled in favor of the father. At that moment, Tatum lost her final anchor. She was left alone against a world that had once put her on a pedestal, but was now content to simply watch her hit rock bottom, too broken to even cry out for help. When a person loses what they hold most dear, their children, and their very reason to wake up in the morning, the world around them rapidly loses its color. The 90s and early 2000s became a period Tatum O'Neal would later describe as a long stay in purgatory. Picture a woman whose face was once recognized by every single American, now wandering the streets of New York City, desperately trying to remain invisible. She was no longer a screen icon. She had become a shadow, seeking solace in things that promised a temporary escape, but in reality only hollowed out her soul. This was a time when her life turned into an endless cycle of fresh starts, followed by bitter relapses. She tried to return to acting, taking small roles here and there, but the industry was cold. Hollywood has no mercy for those who are minded of its own dark side. To producers, she had become too difficult, too high risk. Tatum was caught in a catch-22. She couldn't get work because she wasn't trusted, and she wasn't trusted because without a purpose, she sank deeper into her addictions. Her daily route was reduced to drugstores and street corners. She sought refuge in prescriptions and illicit substances to numb the pain of being separated from her kids, but the price of that numbness was a total disconnect from reality. The loudest and most painful blow came in 2008. Headlines flashed across the globe. Oscar winner arrested in drug buy. To the general public, it was just another scandalous mugshot in the tabloids, an excuse to click their tongues and say, "Look how far she's fallen." But for Tatum, it was a moment of absolute nakedness before the world. She stood before the police, exhausted, lonely, and stripped of her former glow. It was the reckoning we spoke of, but sometimes a public rock bottom is the only floor solid enough to jump off of. During these years, she also did something few dared to do. She started telling the truth. Tatum wrote her memoirs, offering a brutally honest, unvarnished look at her family life, her father's actions, and how easy it is to lose your soul under the spotlights. It wasn't just a grab for money, it was an act of survival. She wanted the world to see the human being behind the scandalous actress, a person who simply couldn't carry the weight that was placed on her shoulders at the age of 10. By then, her relationship with her father was nothing but ashes. They would try to reconcile in front of cameras for a reality show, only to drift apart again, trading barbs in interviews. It was an endless drama with no winners. Tatum finally faced the bitter truth. The little girl inside her was still waiting for love from a man who was physically incapable of giving it. That decades-long battle for her father's validation finally began to give way to a more vital urge, the will to survive and protect the little she had left, her dignity and the chance to reconcile with her kids, who were now adults with lives of their own. You know, in the movies, things usually end with a grand victory or a beautiful stroll into the sunset. But in real life, especially in the life of Tatum O'Neal, the finale isn't a period, it's an ellipses. Today, she is no longer that spunky kid from Paper Moon, nor is she the broken woman from the police blotter. She is a person simply learning how to live again. taking each new day as a gift, and this path to inner peace has proven far more difficult for her than the road to the Oscars. In recent years, fate tested her resilience more than ever before. In 2020, Tatum suffered a severe stroke brought on by a drug overdose. She fell into a coma, and the doctor's prognosis was grim. It seemed like the tragic end everyone had feared. But Tatum surprised everyone. She didn't just survive, she fought for the ability to speak and walk again. There was something deeply symbolic in this trial. She literally had to piece her identity back together from the shards, learning to pronounce the words that used to come so easily to her. This was her most honest performance, one without cameras or applause, just her and her will to live. Today, Tatum O'Neal lives a quiet, almost reclusive life. She no longer seeks Hollywood's validation, nor does she try to prove to her father, Ryan, that she is worthy of love. Sadly, Ryan passed away in late 2023. Their relationship remained a tangled knot of resentment and unspoken words until the very end, but Tatum found the strength to forgive him. She realized that her father was himself a hostage of that system and that era, and that forgiveness finally brought her the liberation she had craved for decades. Now, her greatest joy are her children and grandchildren. The very children she once thought she had lost forever have become her foundation. She managed to break the cycle of generational trauma, becoming the kind, understanding grandmother she never had herself. Looking at her story, you can't help but wonder, was that gold statuette worth all those years of agony? Probably not, but it was that very pain that forged the Tatum O'Neal of today, a wise, soulful, and finally free woman. She is no longer the golden girl, she is a survivor. Her journey reminds us that even after the longest and darkest fall, you can find the strength to rise. Tatum's story isn't about the fading of a star, it's about a person finding their way back to themselves once the world's spotlights have dimmed. That is her legacy. The next time you see footage of the Oscars and some young talent is clutching that award, remember Tatum. Remember that behind the brilliance, there is always a shadow, and that the most important thing in life isn't the adoration of millions, but the peace in your own soul and the warmth of those who love you not for your roles, but simply for who you are.